the 32 families who abandoned their homes overnight in Maple Hollow Village. The first snowfall of 1847 settled like a white shroud over the hills of New England, muffling every sound and softening every shape into silence. When travelers from the neighboring settlement of Dunstable came upon Maple Hollow that morning, they found the village still and waiting, as if life had paused in the middle of its own breath. Doors stood open, rocking gently in the cold wind. Smoke curled from chimneys, though no hands tended the fires. On wooden tables inside the homes, bread sat half-sliced, bowls of stew untouched, chairs pushed back as if the families had risen mid-meal. Yet no voices called, no footsteps echoed in the lanes. A settlement of 32 families gone as if swallowed whole in a single night. At first, the men from Dunstable believed it was a migration. Hunger had gnawed at the land for years, and Maple Hollow had not been spared. Perhaps the villagers had set out in the night to seek food or shelter elsewhere. But when they looked closer, they saw that no wagons had been taken, no horses harnessed. Winter clothes are still hung by the hearths. In the snow that lay deep along the road, there were no tracks leading away, no wheel ruts, no sign of departure. It was as though every family had risen from their tables and simply dissolved into the air, leaving behind only the warmth of their last movements. The travelers searched each house, calling out names they knew, for Maple Hollow had always been part of the wider web of New England communities. They found everything one might expect in a village on a winter morning, except the people. In one cabin, a cradle rocked softly as though an infant had only just been lifted from it. In another, a pot of water boiled down to steam, scorching the bottom with a smell of burning iron. In the blacksmith shop, a pair of gloves still lay across the anvil, the fingers curled and stiff with soot, waiting for hands that would never return to claim them. Each house was both ordinary and wrong, the details of life still intact while life itself had vanished. Fear crept into the searchers as the hours passed. The silence was not that of abandonment but of interruption. It felt less like people had left, and more like they had been erased. In the church, candles still burned on the altar, wax dripping down in strange rivers across the wood. The Bible lay open to pages describing sacrifice and obedience, its words underlined with a heavy, angry hand. The benches were askew, some overturned, as though those who sat there had been forced to rise quickly. And yet no footprints marred the snow pressed down outside the door. The Dunstable men returned home shaken, and within days rumors began to spread. Some whispered that sickness had carried the villagers off in the night, their bodies buried secretly to prevent contagion. Others claimed the native tribes had struck without leaving a trace, though no arrow or mark of violence was found. Still others, lowering their voices, said it was no act of men at all. They told of how Maple Hollow had always felt strange, how the Reverend's sermons grew darker in recent years, how hymns sung there carried on a melody that unsettled even those who did not understand why. It was said that silence had always ruled that valley, and now silence had taken its price. When word reached the county officials, an investigation was ordered, though the snow had grown deep and travel itself was perilous. Weeks later, when officials finally trudged into Maple Hollow, they found the same haunting stillness that the Dunstable men described. The homes remained furnished, the food spoiled upon the tables, the fires long since gone to ash. Nothing had been taken, nothing explained. They recorded every detail with care, yet every detail only sharpened the absence. It was not what they found that chilled them, but what they did not find. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no farewell letters, no evidence of where 32 families had gone. The officials closed the matter with cautious words. The records spoke of likely migration under duress, though even they knew the explanation did not fit. The papers were shelved, the questions left unanswered. Maple Hollow remained empty, the snow piling higher against its doorways with each passing storm. Over time, travelers avoided the place. Some swore they heard faint singing at night, a choir of distant voices that carried over the frozen hills. Others claimed that when they passed through in daylight, they saw shadows moving inside the houses, as if the families had never left. But when they stepped inside, nothing remained, only the dust and the cold. The mystery of Maple Hollow took root in the minds of those who heard it. For some, it was a story of tragedy, of families forced to abandon their homes in desperation. For others, it was a warning, a sign of curses or unnatural forces at work. Children grew up hearing their parents speak of it as a lesson. Never trust a village too quiet. Never follow a man too gentle. Never believe that silence means peace. The name Maple Hollow became a boundary on the map, a place to be skirted, avoided, and left to its ghosts. Yet the truth of what happened that night would not remain buried forever. Years later, when the ice thawed and the ruins of Maple Hollow were disturbed once more, fragments began to surface, writings, artifacts, whispers preserved in the cracks of wood and stone. These traces would reveal that the emptiness of the village had not been caused by abandonment or disease. It had been shaped methodically by a single mind that found power in silence and purity in pain. A mind that had hidden behind scripture and kindness, biding its time until it could erase not just individuals but entire families, entire histories. Maple Hollow was not a village that disappeared. It was a village that was hollowed out piece by piece until only silence remained. And so the story begins not with what was seen, but with what was missing. A place once alive, now stilled. A community once bound together, now scattered like ash in the wind. The empty village was not the ending, but the first sign of something older, deeper, and far more deliberate. The villagers remembered Reverend Tobias Grain as a man who never raised his voice. He moved like a winter shadow through Maple Hollow, coat drawn close, boots clean in mud season, hands folded as if in prayer. When he preached, he stood still and quietly did the work before his words arrived. People said they felt calmer after speaking with him, as if their worries had been sorted into drawers. He turned pain tidy and promised fear would fold if one learned to be still. He had not been born among them. He arrived with a letter and a wagon of books labeled in careful ink, paid his first month at the inn by mending chairs, sat with the dying without taking a coin, and walked the fields with farmers. He married a quiet widow, Miriam Grain, who believed his patients could stitch her life back together. He chose a deacon, Ephraim Bell, a strong man with gentle hands eager to be useful. He changed nothing all at once. First the hymn tempos slowed, then pauses lengthened between verses until the congregation learned to hold their breath on command. He spoke of purity as a practice, like water running through gravel until only clear drops remained. He asked children to stand very still and listen for the smallest sound. He told parents that stillness would teach obedience better than scolding. The village began to treat silence like medicine. The Reverend kept 2 books. The open ledger showed births, deaths, loaves baked, quilts sewn, visits made. It proved he was useful. The second book, bound in gray cloth, never left his study. He called it The Keys. Entries were short and plain: quiet first, then heat. Breath held, then surrender. Pain named, then gone. He made lists of families and wrote a single number beside each, changing it week to week. Miriam kept the parsonage warm and the table set for callers. She embroidered small white crosses for the poor and believed her husband was lifting the village out of despair. Yet she felt it sometimes. The way his gaze measured a person like a carpenter measures wood before cutting. He asked her to boil water each evening and lay clean cloth on the table, the kind used when a baby was born or a body laid out. He said it was for visitations. Ephraim Bell changed under Tobias. Once known for loud laughter, he began to speak in a whisper. He started to appear at doorways before sunrise to escort families to gatherings, watched latecomers with tender disapproval, and learned to match the Reverend's breathing in the pews. He reported small victories with pride: a child who fidgeted less, a house that stopped singing worldly songs, a mother who wept without making a sound. At the edge of town stood an old ice house dug into a hill, cool even in summer. Tobias asked the men to repair its door, saying it would store winter charity. He thanked them by name and blessed their tools. He told Miriam that order begins with preparation, and told Ephraim that some gifts must be kept cold until the right moment. The phrase fit neatly in their ears and left no edges to catch doubt. The ice house soon had a new lock. Small customs became rules. Mothers learned to calm crying infants by pressing 2 fingers at the hollow above the breastbone, a trick the Reverend taught for soothing fear. Men at the forge practiced holding breath while hammering, training the will. Children played a game where the winner was the one who could stand silent the longest without blinking. Tobias praised winners in public and visited the other homes at night. Winter tightened its grip and gathering hours stretched. In the church, the pauses between hymns deepened until time felt like it was being lowered down a well. People went home emptied and slept hard. They woke with the memory of being watched and called it care. The Reverend walked the lanes after dark, counting chimney breaths, pausing at doors to listen for how long a household could keep still. He marked the numbers in gray ink. Months before the village emptied, a farmer's wife named Eliza Pike vanished after an evening of silent prayer. Tobias wrote her name in the ledger with a note about her frail health and comforted the family with soft words. He preached that Sunday about the soul's journey and the beauty of a life surrendered to order. No one asked where Eliza went. The question would have broken the surface of the quiet Maple Hollow had learned to treasure. By the first snow, Tobias Grain no longer needed to speak to be obeyed. He needed only to pause, and a room would hold its breath for him. He stood at the center of a web built from favor, routine, and the sweet relief that comes when someone else decides what is right. Peace had become a habit. Submission had become a skill. And in a valley where storms last long, people will do anything to feel the air go still. The Reverend's gray book, The Keys, was never meant for other eyes. Its pages were lined not with scripture but with careful records, precise as ledgers of trade. Each entry described trials, refinements, and outcomes as if silence itself could be studied like crops in the field. He wrote of tests, small at first, the child who was asked to hold her breath while counting backward. The farmer's wife who was asked to kneel on cold stone through the night. The blacksmith's apprentice who was told to keep still while a coal burned near his skin. These were called exercises, written in tidy script beside numbers that marked duration, resistance, surrender. But as weeks passed, the tests changed. Tobias began to call them steps. He believed the voice was a barrier to purity, that noise was a rebellion. He wrote that sound had to be broken, not suppressed, if one hoped to reach what he called true stillness. The methods he devised were not the cruelties of drunkards or soldiers. They were designed, symbolic, precise. He did not seek to kill noise, but to transform it. The first subjects were always the obedient. A farmer named Nathaniel Ames volunteered to be tested, proud to prove his devotion. Tobias instructed him to hold a small, smooth stone beneath his tongue while he recited verses. Each word scraped his mouth raw, the stone grinding against flesh until it bled. When Nathaniel faltered, Tobias wrote, 2 minutes, broken. The man thanked him afterward, believing he had failed God rather than his reverend. Soon the exercises grew sharper. Tobias stitched thin horsehair through the edges of tongues, drawing lips shut so prayers would be mouthed rather than spoken. He told the faithful that the Lord hears silence more clearly than sound. Mothers wept as their children whimpered, but Tobias stood near with his calm hands, whispering blessings as he pulled the thread tight. The children's tears dried quickly, and in days many forgot how to speak without pain. Tobias recorded the results with satisfaction. "Better," he wrote. "The voice is yielding." In the ice house, where the air was damp and still, the Reverend performed what he called refinements. He believed the throat was the root of defiance. His notes described piercing vocal cords with heated needles, a cruelty so exact that it burned away the ability to shout without killing the body. Those who survived were left to breathe in whispers, their voices ragged like torn cloth. Tobias recorded their names with approval, marking them as freed. To him, the ruined voice was proof of a soul obedient at last. Even teeth became tools of devotion. In one experiment, Tobias pried molars from a young man named Elias Cobb and replaced them with sharpened shards of animal bone. He declared it a ritual of truth, that mouths must hold only what nature provided in raw form. Elias lived, though he could eat only soft bread and broth. He wandered the village with bloodied gums, praised as a living vessel of endurance. Others began to envy his suffering, believing it proof of greater holiness. Tobias smiled at this envy, for it meant his hold was deepening. The more pain he orchestrated, the more grateful his congregation became. Families told themselves that silence kept them safe, that obedience brought them closer to light. What they did not see was the pattern forming behind the Reverend's calm gaze. He had turned their faith into an experiment, their devotion into a laboratory. Each cut, each stitch, each burning iron was not random cruelty, it was data. Miriam, his wife, suspected nothing. She knew the visits were frequent, that her husband asked for more cloth, more clean water, more herbs to dull pain. but she believed it was ministry. She told herself that suffering was part of life, and Tobias was guiding them through it. She sat by the window in the evenings, sewing white crosses, while in the ice house Tobias measured how long a child could endure breath held under a wet cloth, how long a man could stand as wax sealed his mouth shut. It was Ephraim Bell who first saw too much. As Tobias's deacon, he carried wood for the fires and fetched water from the well. He watched as men left the reverend's care, unable to speak above a whisper, their tongues swollen or stitched. He carried children home who no longer sang, who pressed their hands to their throats as though guarding a secret. Yet Ephraim did not resist. He convinced himself that doubt was sin, that the reverend was molding them into a stronger flock, and in his own silence he became the reverend's accomplice. By late winter, the village no longer sounded like a village. Laughter faded. Hymns were sung only in hollow hums. At night, the only noise was the hiss of wind across the eaves. Families grew accustomed to this quiet, even proud of it. Outsiders who visited found the place unsettling, as though its people had forgotten how to live. But the villagers felt chosen, bound by rituals that no one else could understand. In his gray book, Tobias wrote the line that would define the coming months: "Sound must die before the body. Noise is rebellion. Silence is salvation." He had refined his theory, tested it upon the flesh of his congregation, and found it true enough for his own dark gospel. And as snow pressed heavier upon the roofs of Maple Hollow, the Reverend prepared to extend his experiments, from the quieting of individuals to the breaking of families. He had learned that one body could be silenced with thread and fire. Now he wished to know how silence might bind 32 families together into one submission, one ritual, one hollowed-out village. The ice house would not be enough. He would need chambers, he would need witnesses, and most of all, he would need faith strong enough to believe that agony was devotion. Tobias Grain had found his method, and now he was ready to scale it. The hymnal was found years later, its leather cover warped from damp, its pages smudged by hands too small to hold it steady. The words inside were familiar but wrong, the script crude as though copied by children who had not yet learned their letters. Verses that once praised mercy had been altered into songs about drowning, burning, and bones broken for light. The villagers of Maple Hollow had sung these songs in unison, voices trembling in the candlelit church, until their very children carried them into the lanes and fields. Neighbors remembered hearing the little ones chanting verses about fire consuming the faithful, their shrill tones turning scripture into mockery. Tobias Grain had called it purification. He taught that innocence belonged not in laughter but in obedience. He told parents that the Lord most clearly spoke through children, and therefore children must be shaped into instruments of silence. He gathered them in the nave after services, lined them in circles, and gave them new verses he had written in the margins of his own Bible. At first the changes were slight, a word removed, a phrase shortened. But soon the song spoke only of surrender, of bodies breaking open so that souls might escape. The parents, weary and desperate, listened as their children sang these new hymns and told themselves it was holy. The rituals deepened. The children were made to march in slow circles, singing until their voices cracked. They were told to hold their breath on the final line, to prove they trusted God more than air. Some collapsed in exhaustion, their bodies trembling as Tobias nodded in approval. Ephraim Bell, standing guard at the door, carried the fainted children to benches where they gasped for breath. Parents wept softly, ashamed that their sons and daughters had failed the Reverend's test of faith. Tobias wrote in his gray book, "The young are pliant. They enter silence more quickly." Then came the ash. Tobias claimed that fire was the purest voice, that ash was its scripture. He mixed soot from the church hearth into small bowls and told the children to inhale it as they sang. He said it would line their lungs with holiness, preparing them for eternity. Some coughed and cried, but the Reverend pressed their shoulders and told them pain was proof of devotion. Within weeks, several children grew thin and weak, their lips darkened, their breath shallow. Families said it was a winter illness. Tobias said it was proof they were chosen. The worst discovery came when bodies were found in shallow graves outside the village long after Maple Hollow was empty. These were not adults, but children, their lungs packed with powdered ash, their throats sealed with wax. The forensic accounts of later centuries called it suffocation, deliberate and cruel. But Tobias had called it offering. He had told parents that the silence of a child was the clearest hymn to heaven. He convinced them that sacrifice was the truest gift and that their grief was holy if they endured it without protest. The village believed him, because to doubt him would have meant admitting they had handed their children to death. Miriam Grain noticed the change most of all. She had once heard laughter through the lanes, games played in the snow, nursery rhymes carried on the wind. Now she heard only the flat hum of voices repeating words that no child should ever know. She asked her husband if they might teach softer hymns again, the ones about lambs and shepherds. Tobias looked at her for a long time before answering. He told her that lambs must be broken before they can be offered. Miriam said nothing more. Silence had become her survival. By that winter, Maple Hollow no longer knew joy. The children did not play. They walked in lines, humming songs about fire and drowning. Parents stood by with pale faces, pride and dread mingling in their eyes. To outsiders, the village looked uncanny, as if life had been drained of its natural rhythm. Travelers who stopped in the inn said they left unsettled, unable to forget the sight of children singing of bones and breathless nights with unwavering seriousness. Yet no one intervened. No one stopped them. Tobias recorded everything. He noted how long a child could march before falling, how many breaths they could hold before fainting, how their voices shifted when ash thickened their throats. He saw them not as innocents, but as perfect vessels, malleable and unresisting. He wrote in the keys, "The child breaks clean. Their silence comes without fight. The parents' tears are proof of devotion." What the Reverend created was not a choir, but a machine of surrender. Each child's silence became an instrument in his larger symphony of control. Families that might have questioned him now found themselves bound by grief, unable to admit what they had allowed. And so they sang louder, marched longer, and obeyed more fiercely, hoping to prove that their faith outweighed their sorrow. Maple Hollow was becoming a place where even mourning was forbidden to make a sound. Silence was no longer the absence of noise. It was obedience, it was survival, it was devotion. And in the hollow breaths of children forced to sing of their own destruction, the Reverend found the perfect echo of his own dark faith. By the middle of that winter, Tobias Grain no longer needed to persuade the people of Maple Hollow. They had grown so accustomed to silence, so trained to equate stillness with salvation, that when he introduced the next stage of devotion, most accepted it without question. He called it the hollowing. The phrase spread like a benediction. Families whispered it to one another as if it explained everything they did not dare ask. The hollowing began with selection. Each household, Tobias decreed, would give one member to the ritual, a living vessel whose body would be offered to ensure the purity of the rest. He claimed the scriptures spoke of vessels emptied of self, filled only with the fire of God. To disobey was to put the whole village at risk of corruption. To obey was to guarantee that Maple Hollow would endure through famine, disease, and judgment. Parents looked to their children, children to their parents, and in the terrible quiet, decisions were made. The chosen were taken to the church cellar. The floorboards there hid a chamber dug deep into the earth, its walls lined with rough stone and its air heavy with damp. At the center stood a wooden table blackened by old soot, its surface carved with crude marks that looked like scripture but were only Tobias's own invention. Miriam prepared the chamber each night, laying clean cloths, fetching bowls of resin and wax. She did not ask questions. She folded her grief into the work and told herself she was helping. The ritual itself was a choreography of control. Tobias would strip the choice of their clothes and bind them with cords soaked in oil. He would instruct Ephraim Bell to read altered verses in a slow, steady rhythm, while families knelt in silence above. The first cut was always across the chest, shallow but deliberate, opening the body to prove it had been claimed. Tobias believed bones were cages holding the spirit hostage. So he worked methodically to remove them piece by piece while his subject remained alive. Witnesses later described, in journals smuggled out, how ribs were pried away with iron tools and replaced with branches coated in burning resin. As the fire consumed the wood, it filled the hollowed body with heat, turning the sacrifice into a vessel of living flame. Their screams were smothered with wax poured down the throat, sealing the airway and muting every sound. The body writhed, but only in silence, and Tobias declared this the purest prayer, agony without voice. Families were told to listen for the crackle of resin, not the cries of their loved ones. They were told that each spark was a hymn, each burst of flame a plea answered. When the ritual ended, the remains were buried in the earth beneath the church, and the family was praised for their devotion. No one spoke of what they saw. To question was to betray not only the reverend but the memory of the one they had offered. In time, the hollowing became a rhythm of life in Maple Hollow. Each month, another name was given. Some households volunteered eagerly, convinced that to be chosen was an honor. Others resisted quietly but were shamed by neighbors until they relented. Tobias kept careful records in his gray book, listing which families had given and which had not, marking those who delayed with stern black ink. The pressure of the village itself ensured obedience. Children learned to whisper about the hollowing as if it were a holiday. They drew crude pictures of bodies filled with fire, their innocence bending to the will of ritual. Parents sat at their tables staring at empty chairs, telling themselves their grief was sacred. And Miriam, moving silently between kitchen and cellar, told herself her hands were clean because she only carried water, only washed clothes and only laid out the tools. Yet in her heart she knew she was part of it all, the ice house filled with remnants. Bones scorched black, fragments of resin fused with marrow, scraps of cloth stiffened with wax. Tobias kept them stored in labeled jars, calling them relics. He told the village that these relics would one day speak, that they held within them the silent voices of the faithful. He displayed them during sermons, holding up ribs charred with resin, whispering that even in destruction, silence endured. The people bowed their heads, unable to look away. The hollowing transformed Maple Hollow. It was no longer a settlement, but a shrine. No home was untouched by the ritual. No family was without absence. Yet, rather than fracture the community, it bound them tighter. Shared grief became shared loyalty. Shared silence became the only language they spoke. Outsiders who visited could not understand how 32 families had surrendered so completely. But within the valley, resistance no longer existed. The Reverend's doctrine had seeped too deep. The cruelty of the hollowing lay not only in the act itself, but in its purpose. Tobias did not believe in God. His confessions would later reveal that he never had. What he believed in was control, the ability to shape a community so completely that they would harm themselves at his command. Each vessel burned in silence was not an offering to heaven, but a victory for him. He had hollowed out their voices, their choices, their lives, and replaced them with his own will. When spring came, Maple Hollow was no longer a village of farmers and children. It was a place of empty chairs, of hymns sung in whispers, of eyes that no longer met one another's gaze. Every family bore the wound of the hollowing, and yet they carried on, convinced that silence had saved them. Tobias Grain had achieved what few men dared imagine. He had turned devotion into destruction, and no one dared name it evil. The hollowing was not a ritual of faith. It was a rehearsal for erasure, and soon it would not be one body at a time. Soon Tobias would demand the silence of them all. By the final months of winter, Maple Hollow was no longer a village, but a hushed experiment. Tobias Grain had tested his theories upon children, mothers, fathers, and the chosen sacrifices of the hollowing. Now he turned his eyes toward the entire. One body was no longer enough. He wanted silence made communal, a single breathlessness that encompassed every household, every hearth, every life. He called it the mass silence. The preparation was as methodical as it was hidden. Beneath barns and cellars, Tobias ordered the digging of narrow chambers, instructing that they be sealed with timber and clay to trap warmth. He told the families they were building sanctuaries, safe places against the famine and the plague. He praised their labor and blessed the tools that cut into the frozen ground. But his gray book revealed the truth. He was building tombs. He called them wombs of silence. On the nights when the moon was thin, entire families were summoned. Ephraim Bell went house to house, his quiet knock carrying authority no one dared refuse. Mothers carried infants, fathers held lanterns, children shuffled with heads bowed. They entered the underground chambers, clutching blankets and bowls of ash Tobias gave them. He told them to breathe it deeply, to let their lungs drink the silence. Families obeyed, believing the Reverend's voice more than their own instincts. When the doors were closed, smoke was fed into the narrow spaces. Bundles of resin, damp straw, and herbs were burned, filling the air with a heavy sweetness that dulled thought and smothered breath. At first, families sang the hymns Tobias had taught them, their voices thin in the smoke. But soon the songs broke into coughing, gasping, then into nothing at all. The Reverend recorded every trial in his gray book. The time it took before silence fell, the number of bodies that endured longest, the families who submitted most completely. Some resisted. A farmer named Samuel Reed tried to pry open the chamber door with his bare hands, splinters cutting into his palms. His wife screamed, breaking the sacred stillness. For this, Tobias declared their family unworthy. They were taken not back to their home, but to the cellar of the church where they vanished into the rituals of the hallowing. Their neighbors, instead of mourning, whispered that disobedience had only proven the Reverend's warnings true. Fear made the village complicit. The silence began to spill into the daylight hours. Children no longer played in the lanes. Doors stayed closed even in the sun. Hearths burned, but no songs or laughter rose with the smoke. Families grew thin, eyes hollowed, yet they still gathered when Tobias commanded. The air of Maple Hollow became heavy, as though the entire valley had joined in holding one breath. Travelers who passed through in early spring remarked that the place felt emptied, though they still saw shadows moving in the houses. In truth, many of those shadows belonged to no one living. The chambers underground became permanent graves, their doors sealed tight with clay. Entire households suffocated together in smoke and silence, convinced it was salvation. Tobias wrote, "Better than one vessel is many." Silence multiplied becomes eternal. His experiment had moved beyond individuals to the village itself. Miriam, still tending the parsonage, began to sense the enormity of what her husband had wrought. She found scraps of cloth stiffened with ash, bowls overturned in the chambers. The imprint of tiny fingers clawed against timber. At night she lay awake, hearing the faint echoes of coughing from beneath the earth. She pressed her hands against her ears, telling herself it was the wind. But she knew. The silence Tobias demanded was built from the last gasps of her neighbors, her friends, the children she had once taught to sew. And still she did nothing. Fear bound her tighter than love. To speak aloud would mean joining the voices already buried. So she carried water, folded clothes, and kept the house warm, her complicity as deliberate as Tobias's cruelty. By the thaw of spring, Maple Hollow had already begun to vanish. Outwardly, the houses still stood, fires still burned, tools still leaned against barns. But within, families were gone, sealed into chambers that no one would open again. The empty chairs at the tables multiplied, and the silence grew heavier until there was nothing left to hear. The mass silence was Tobias Grain's greatest achievement, though he never called it his own. To the people it was holiness fulfilled. To him it was proof that a village could be erased without a scream, that obedience could consume generations in a single winter night. He had hollowed their voices, then their bodies, and finally their community. Only silence remained, perfect and complete. When outsiders arrived weeks later, they found Maple Hollow exactly as it had been left. Meals half-eaten, fires smoldering, doors ajar. But they did not see the chambers hidden beneath. They did not smell the ash that lingered in the earth. They did not know that 32 families had chosen or been forced to inhale silence until it became their grave. Maple Hollow did not fall to famine or plague or war. It fell to devotion twisted into obedience, and obedience twisted into erasure. The Reverend's experiment was complete. The village had not been abandoned. It had been entombed by its own faith. The confession did not surface in Maple Hollow. It turned up decades later in a church attic 2 counties away, tucked inside a tin bread box tied with blue ribbon and sealed in wax. The curate who opened it expected a ledger or a family Bible. Instead, he found thin pages numbered in Tobias Grain's careful hand, each line steady without crossings out, as if every sentence had been rehearsed before ink touched paper. He carried the bundle to his rector. Together they read the first line. "I will set down the method because the method will outlive me." Tobias began where most men plead, yet he asked for no mercy. He titled the packet simply, "Confession of Method." Faith, he wrote, was his tool the way a carpenter uses a square, not to measure heaven, but to keep human minds from wandering. The world is loud, and noise is the language of disobedience. Pain is only a lever. Silence is the lock and the key. When breath pauses, the soul remembers its place. Once a soul remembers its place, a village can be arranged like furniture. He recalled how he learned control. As a young assistant in a coastal parish, he watched a gale throw fishermen to their knees. Nothing he spoke calmed them. Then the wind collapsed into stillness, and in that hush they quieted without being told. The sea preached his first sermon. After that he collected small tricks of stillness. How to wait until a room forgot it could speak. How to praise until a man went pliant. How to replace prayer with routine, a grain at a time, so no one noticed the exchange. He admitted he chose Maple Hollow for its shape. The valley kept sound. The snow swallowed the rest. Hunger made people listen. He arrived gentle on purpose, mending chairs, sitting with the dying, learning which faces needed softness and which needed rule. "Trust is a door," he wrote. "Walk through once, and each visit after grows easier." He sorted the village like a ledger. Those who performed obedience for the eyes of others, those who required a witness to their pain, those who would become his messengers. His notes on trials were measured and cold. He listed the angle of needles that blunted a shout without stopping breath, the length of horsehair that sealed lips without cutting through, the heat of wax that hardened fast yet did not burn. Children accepted ash more fully than adults because they had not yet argued with air. The hollowing was a lesson in vacancy. Neighbors, he wrote, are worth 10 deacons if given the right phrases. He called the ice house a chapel for beginnings and the church cellar a furnace where silence could be shaped. He insisted that he did not hate them. "Hatred distracts," he wrote. "I needed a clean mind." He thanked Maple Hollow for learning so well, calling it the only congregation that understood. Yet he admitted a thrill he could not hide. He loved the instant a room surrendered, the fragile click when many bodies held the same breath. The mass silence was, in his words, a cathedral without stone. The purest sound in the world is a last inhale that chooses not to return. Certain lines made the rector place both palms on the table. Tobias dated events by weather instead of calendar to blur the trail. He used the phrase "walked under" for families sent into chambers. A later page explained that those rooms were wombs where speech dies before flesh. He confessed that he sealed the doors from outside and listened with a cup against the wood, timing the final coughs as if they were bells. One sheet held a single sentence across its middle. They obeyed. There was no prayer attached, only the fact of it. He wrote to no court. He addressed only posterity. Hard winters and soft laws will always build towns like yours, he warned, and any patient man can arrange them into a choir. If you promise safety during a season of fear, people will repay you with their breath. That line made the rector order the packet resealed. But the curate, sleepless, made a copy first. He told himself it was insurance. It was also conscious. The copy would outlive him, as he suspected the original might disappear. When the confession reached officials, it met the quiet every scandal meets when guilt would cost too much to name. There were hearings, sorrow, prayers for the dead. No spades opened the hill, no jury walked the cellar. The houses fell in on themselves under heavy later snows. And the story slid back into rumor, something a traveler might mention and a host might wave away with a shiver. The curate kept reading his copy, the sentences lodged like a stone behind his ribs. Near death, that curate wrote a note in the margin and sent the packet to a historian. The danger is not the blades or the wax. It is the first pause, the moment you obey because everyone else is quiet. The historian published a careful account. People read it on trains and in parlors and decided the century had outgrown such obedience. But the confession did not end like a ghost story. It ended with instructions. Find valleys that hold sound, choose a helper, pace a season, rename. Rituals so ordinary mouths can carry them. Reward stillness with favor. Seal doors with apology, not threat. Sign nothing but the air. Grain still set down his name and pressed his ring into the wax. The paper smelled faintly of resin even after decades. Once opened, something in it would not stop breathing. The last pencil mark on the historian's copy asks the plainest question. How many valleys listen for a voice like his even now? And how fast would we hush if it was asked? When Maple Hollow was first discovered empty, the officials who came with ledgers and pens wrote words that sounded practical. Migration, famine, hardship. They did not know of the chambers beneath the ground. They did not smell the resin that clung to the beams. They did not see the ash stiffening the dirt. They recorded what they wished had been true. That families had gone elsewhere, that life would surface again in spring. But time proved the lie. No one returned. The village decayed, its silence unbroken except by wind. Decades later, when Tobias Grain's confession surfaced, the county had already changed its borders, maps redrawn so that Maple Hollow was barely a dot at the edge of the paper. Officials resisted reopening the case. The thought of unearthing what had been buried was too much for men who lived by order. And yet whispers persisted. Farmers in the hills told of plows striking bone. Children claimed to hear muffled hymns if they pressed their ears to the ground. Travelers avoided the road that cut near the ruined church, saying the valley was too quiet, as if the air itself held its breath. The community beyond Maple Hollow struggled with its shame. Some argued the Reverend had been a madman and the family's only victims. Others insisted the villagers must have known, must have given their silence as freely as their obedience. Either way, the story unsettled them. No one wished to admit how easily faith had turned into complicity. For years the place was left alone, houses collapsing into the earth, timbers rotting, the church spire toppling into weeds. Only the cellar remained, stone walls sunken but unbroken, holding its secrets like teeth clenched tight. In the late 19th century, reformers petitioned for oversight of religious gatherings. They cited Maple Hollow as proof that isolation bred madness. that no community should answer to a single voice unchecked. Laws passed quietly requiring records of sermons, inspections of schools, registries of birth and burial. Few spoke the village's name aloud, but its shadow moved behind the ink. Yet even then the changes felt fragile, born not of outrage but of fear that such silence might spread again. By the turn of the century, a small memorial was proposed, a stone marker at the edge of the valley bearing the number 32. No names, for none could be proven. When it was raised, locals smashed it within a year. To remember was to risk shame. To forget was easier. The ruins sank deeper into grass and snow. Trees thickened where fields had once spread. Maple Hollow vanished into absence, the same absence Tobias Grain had cherished. Still, stories survived. Parents warned children not to follow strangers who spoke gently. Teachers whispered that silence was not always virtue. A ballad circulated in nearby towns, sung in taverns, about a valley that swallowed its own voices. Each retelling softened details, but the core remained. Obedience can be deadlier than hunger. The village became folklore, half ghost tale, half sermon. Outsiders scoffed, yet the people who lived nearest still walked wide around the place. Few dared step inside. Miriam Grain's name appeared once more in parish notes, a widow who moved away and died quietly, buried without children. Ephraim Bell vanished entirely, though rumors claimed his descendants lived under different names. The rest of Maple Hollow left no heirs. Their bloodlines ended beneath the clay-sealed doors. The silence Tobias demanded stretched forward not through family but through absence itself. Historians in the 20th century returned to the story. They unearthed fragments. Charred bones fused with resin, wax-stiffened cloth. Hymnal pages rewritten in a child's hand. Each discovery confirmed the confession. Yet each paper that printed the findings met resistance. Local councils called it exaggeration. Clergymen called it blasphemy. Families who lived in neighboring towns insisted their ancestors had not been complicit. To this day, archives list Maple Hollow as an unresolved disappearance, though the truth is carved into the earth. Silence can erase even evidence if enough people prefer it so. The legacy of Maple Hollow is not a village gone, but a lesson ignored. The laws it inspired grew lax. The marker was destroyed. The ruins were left to rot. What remained was a story told in whispers, stripped of names and detail until it sounded like myth. And yet the myth itself carried a warning. Beware the man who preaches stillness when storms rage. Beware the comfort of obedience when fear makes noise unbearable. Beware silence offered as salvation. Today, hikers sometimes find the valley. They say the ground feels softer, as if hollow beneath. Some report the odd sense of being listened to, though no birds sing there, no wind stirs. A few claim they have heard faint hymns, not sung but hummed, as though voices trapped below still try to rise. No proof is offered, yet those who hear never return a second time. The place repels as much as it tempts. Maple Hollow endures not on maps, but in the unease it leaves behind. Its legacy is carried in laws written out of fear and stories sung with unease, in the silence that falls over a room when its name is mentioned. A village vanished not because of famine or plague, but because one man taught that silence was holy, and 32 families agreed. That is what makes the story so unbearable. Evil did not shout, it whispered, and the people obeyed. When the last house in Maple Hollow collapsed into the weeds, the village ceased to exist in wood or stone. But its silence did not vanish. It seeped outward into archives and whispered stories, into laws half-written and soon forgotten, into the unease of anyone who heard the name spoken in a quiet room. The land healed on the surface, grass rising where doors once opened, snow covering the cellar stones, but underneath the ground lay something deeper than ruins, the proof that entire families had chosen silence, and silence had killed them. The confession of Reverend Tobias Grain sits now in glass, pages flattened by archivists, words copied into textbooks. His handwriting is steady, measured, disturbingly calm. No man who raged could have written lines so even. His sentences reveal a mind that never doubted itself, never faltered, never saw his cruelty as cruelty. In his own words, the people of Maple Hollow were not victims, but instruments. He described their last breaths not with sorrow, but with precision, as a farmer might record a harvest. His words strip away excuses. There was no fever, no curse, no war. There was only one man's method and the obedience of those who followed him. What unsettles historians is not simply the brutality of the hollowing or the suffocation of the mass silence. It is the ordinariness of it. Tobias Grain was not a mad prophet foaming at the mouth, nor a tyrant in armor. He was quiet, tidy, unfailingly polite. He offered comfort before he offered commands. He spoke softly until his silence became law. The villagers did not follow him out of terror. They followed him because it was easier to obey than to question, easier to remain still than to risk breaking the hush. Evil wore the mask of gentleness, and that made it unstoppable. The hollowing shows the cruelty of ritual, but the mass silence shows the cruelty of surrender. When families stepped into the chambers carrying children and blankets, they did not believe they were walking into graves. They believed they were walking into safety. They trusted a man who had taught them that silence was salvation. They had been trained so well that when smoke filled their lungs, many did not resist. They hummed hymns until their voices broke, and then they died believing it was holy. That is the true horror of Maple Hollow, not what Tobias did, but what the people accepted. And yet blame cannot rest only on them. What of the neighbors who heard the strange hymns and looked away? What of the officials who filed reports under migration and closed the books? What of the church that sealed the confession for decades because it was easier to preserve order than to reveal truth? Silence did not stay inside the valley. It spread outward, layer upon layer, until the story itself was smothered. Evil does not need armies when forgetfulness will do. There is an old saying that history is written by the victors. Maple Hollow proves the opposite. History is also erased by the silent. Each family left behind no journals, no protests, no cries carved into wood. Their absence became their legacy. We know their fate only through the words of the man who destroyed them. Their silence allowed his voice to become the only voice that endured. Even in death, Tobias Grain ruled the story. But fragments break through. Charred bones unearthed by farmers, hymnal pages written in childish scrawl. Faint accounts recorded by outsiders who passed through before the end. These fragments resist the hush Tobias tried to impose. They remind us that silence is never total, that something always escapes, even if only in whispers. Perhaps that is why people still shudder at the valley, why some swear they hear faint humming when the wind slides across the grass. The voices of Maple Hollow may have been buried, but they were never entirely erased. The legacy of Maple Hollow is not only about one man's cruelty, it is about the machinery of obedience, the ease with which people surrender when fear and hope are bound together. It is about how silence becomes a weapon sharper than any blade. And it is about how institutions, churches, councils, officials allowed that silence to spread by refusing to confront it. Maple Hollow is a mirror showing how evil can thrive not in noise but in the spaces where no one dares to speak. We comfort ourselves by saying such things belong to the past, that people today are too aware, too skeptical, too free to fall into silence again. But Tobias Grain did not invent anything new. He only used tools that already existed: fear of hunger, desire for safety, longing for belonging. These are not relics of the 19th century, they are constants of human life, and wherever these exist, so too does the possibility that silence will be demanded and freely given. Evil often hides not in violence but in patience. It waits for a moment of weakness, a storm, a famine, a fear too great to face alone. Then it speaks softly, offering order. It teaches obedience slowly until silence feels like relief. It does not scream, it whispers. It does not strike, it persuades. And when it finally reveals its demands, it is often too late, because the habit of silence has already been learned. That is the lesson of Maple Hollow. Standing in the ruins today, nothing remains of the church or the homes. Grass covers the earth and the cellar stones sink deeper each year. Yet the valley itself feels heavy, as if memory is stored in the soil. Visitors who walk there report a pressure in the air, as though the silence is not emptiness but weight. Perhaps it is imagination. Or perhaps silence, once cultivated so deliberately, never entirely fades. Perhaps it lingers, waiting for another voice to awaken it. The story of Maple Hollow closes not with an ending, but with a question. If one man could erase 32 families with nothing but patience, ritual, and the promise of safety, what might another man do in another place, in another time? What would it take for us to obey again? A storm, a famine, a soft voice asking for our silence. What do you think? Could it happen again?